Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the webinar this afternoon for asset management. Quick couple notes here before we get started. If everyone can hear me, or if someone out there could type into the chat box there, and just to make sure that everyone can hear. We want to make sure that we are actually broadcasting today. We are recording as well, so if you guys would like to check this out, or if you know anybody that wants to take a look later on, we will be recording and posting it to the Fruition Partners website. It'll be up in about a week or so, so look for it sometime next week or the following. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to just post those. If we can answer them on the fly, we will. Otherwise, we'll try to cut out some time at the end for answering any questions you throw in there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, this afternoon we'll be talking about asset management. I am Andy Whitlatch. With me is Mike Henderson. We are business analysts with Fruition Partners. Just right off the bat, we'll just give you a little information about who we are and where we come from. Fruition Partners is a IT service management consulting company. We work with clients mostly in the U.S. Most of our clientele is focused here domestically, but we are growing internationally as well. Our client list abroad is growing as we speak. We were started back in 2003. Since that time, we've seen a lot of growth. We keep outgrowing our office spaces at a pretty good pace. So right now we're up to 40 consultants. Both here in Chicago, we've got offices now on the West Coast and the East Coast, and a couple international folks as well. We're focused mainly in the ITSM consulting world, as I mentioned, but as far as industries, we really span across the board with financial services, legal services. We've got social media, manufacturing. We've got companies in energy fields. So really, it's a broad swipe of the economy here. All of our people are certified ITIL professionals at various levels. We have some service managers, and we have some folks that are the just certified professionals. And in addition to that, I mean, we know the theory, and we also have a deep practical day-to-day understanding of service management. We are in the field with experience with these on a daily basis. We are a complete IT service integration provider. Like I said, we deal with education, and that can be from specific ServiceNow training, admin training, to the ITIL courses and ITSM health checks. We also do some administration, virtual admin services, where we can provide support to your IT staff with any development questions that you have, or with ServiceNow release management, as well as taking over your whole ServiceNow development platform and performing some of those routine tasks. We also have some pretty smart developers building some really cool stuff out there, custom apps on top of ServiceNow, doing some amazing work in different platforms, in different areas. So we have the ability to customize to your business some solutions that might be unique to only your company. So again, we like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop for ITSM consulting. Again, from education through consulting to actually managing development and managing services provided by your company to the business. With that, we'll get into the topic at hand today. Here's a brief agenda of what we're going to look at today. Give you a brief overview first of asset management in general, and then we'll get into some of the more detailed stuff. We're going to focus mostly around the CMDB portion today. I realize asset management is a broad category. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's a pretty hot topic these days. So to kind of keep this within reason, we're going to focus mostly on application to the ability to track assets through their life cycle. So as I mentioned, we'll give you a brief overview first. Really, the importance, as I mentioned, it's a pretty growing topic in the industry today. Is people are trying to get a grasp of what's out there, what's in their environment, and you'll see this with companies of all sizes. But one thing that's pretty common is as a company is growing, as it's getting bigger, and there's more liability and risk involved, the importance and the value of managing those assets proactively increases incredibly. So we're seeing a lot of demand to get ahead of that and be proactive as opposed to kind of a reactive and kind of dealing with crises after they have already happened. A lot of the platforms that we see are pretty common among the industries: desktops, laptops, virtual machines, in a sense of both the virtual entity and the physical box or physical boxes that host those virtual machines. There can be some complication there. We won't go into much of that here today, but just to give you an idea that those are some of the things being tracked. They do track servers, clusters, blade racks, things of those natures, and then all the way down to printers, monitors, and Blackberries as well, or other devices as they become more prevalent in the environment. One of the main benefits, I guess, and one of the reasons people or businesses are trying to get ahead of the asset management issue is to comply with some legislation, Sarbanes-Oxley, and being able to account for the assets that are deployed to your company. So one of the main ways, one of the main things that they want to keep track of are depreciation standards and setting goals around being able to refresh machinery and equipment as it ages, and being able to know what's out there and being able to forecast how much resources, both monetary and people on the ground are going to be needed. So as the slide notes there, it simplifies auditing and financial reporting, having these assets being tracked and the ability to easily view the environment. It also simplifies procurement decisions. As I mentioned, you can forecast, ahead of time, excuse me, how many devices you might need to buy in the next quarter or the next year. You can see the age of your environment and get an idea of the upcoming financial requirements in regards to budget or operating costs. This also increases transparency among users and across business units. Having this information available to users and to the managers and executives that need to see it, rather than it becoming a game of chasing around these various spreadsheets or trying to guess who has what with a deadline looming. That can be a pretty stressful situation. So increasing transparency and also increasing security of inventory data, rather than having people editing spreadsheets or passing information via email. This information is all tracked centrally, and you can control who has access to that information. Here's a, a nice slide that I like to show. It's pretty busy, but we'll go through each of the sections here and kind of explain it, because I think it gives a really good high-level picture of what's going on with asset management and how closely it's tied with everything else that's going on in the environment, because it really is a centerpiece to all of the other functions that IT might provide. So if we break this down here a little, across the top you'll see the asset life cycle. This is essentially the various phases that assets will track or that will follow as they go through their life from cradle to grave. Assets start off as purchases. You know, they're planned, they're maybe unplanned, but in any event they are purchased and come into the environment all in much the same manner that they're received. Once they come into the environment, they're received. They're now in your possession, and at that point they may be imaged or go through whatever process you have in place in your business and become available for deployment. Once the need is addressed and they are available and ready to be deployed, then they can go out to the environment, which is what we call production. So they're actually in use, they're out there, they're being utilized by the business. If at any point, you know, they break down, they can go into a state of in repair. They may or may not. Maybe they go their whole life without having any issues. Well, that's great too. So once they've reached the end of their life, then they go to retired, essentially saying these no longer have any value. They're outdated, they're old, and eventually will be sent out to disposal. So destroyed can be doesn't necessarily mean that they are destroyed. It can mean they are recycled, they are resold. At any point, it essentially means they've left the environment. There's no longer any risk associated with that device. So let's skip now to the bottom of that slide and kind of work our way up. So at the base, the foundation of asset management, you have all of this data out there in your environment, whether it's from platform-specific tracking tools. You'll see on the bottom left there the internal sources. So you have BES servers picking up PDA information. You have monitoring tools picking up desktop and laptop or printers, monitors information, and you have server monitoring tools. All this information is valuable stuff, and it will give you a good idea of what's out there and what the health of that equipment is, or the age, or tell you operational information about it. And then you also have on the bottom right, you'll see some external data sources, and this can be information from vendors about what you've bought, information from destruction vendors about what they've destroyed. You also have support contracts and warranties associated with devices. All this information is valuable stuff and can be used in determining some business decisions. So that can all be fed. You'll see the routine feeds going up into the middle section of what they call Consolidated Information Base, or CIB. We also refer to that as a CMDB, a Configuration Management Database. What it essentially is the warehouse of information about your assets. Today we're going to focus mostly on hardware assets and the information associated with those, but it's a very similar process for software assets, and we're seeing a huge increase in demand among the software assets as well, on both the usage side, so deployment and usage as in conjunction with licensing. So making sure that you have enough licenses to cover your users and making sure you're not exposed anyway there. So under the operations section, you'll see all of the different areas of IT service management and how those are interrelated. The colors correspond to the life cycle at the top. So, for example, you have this financial information in the database. So for financial management or supplier management, you can track these assets and integrate these assets from cradle to grave. You see the color associated with purchase there all the way through the color associated with destroyed. So since we are getting some of this financial information right off the bat, that information can be used throughout the asset's life cycle to make decisions. The next column over, you'll see event management, incident and problem management. These things are associated with assets that are deployed in production or already in the environment and are operational. So having that information helps you tie incidents together, tie events together or problems, and track those while those assets are in production. And again, the same thing with change and release management. Those having this information available can be used and leveraged in making those assessments. So again, some of the benefits of getting this information into a configuration management database is it's going to help immediately unlock some new doors for you. Right off the bat, just having a consolidated source of information as opposed to spreadsheets distributed. If you have 80 different locations across the country, then you don't want to have 80 different spreadsheets kept by 80 different people. So along with that, again, is increased transparency. People can go to one space, one spot to see the information they need to get. The centralized management of asset records, again, goes back to getting all that data into one place. This isn't so much of a political statement, so not necessarily one group is managing. If you have a distributed management model for your assets, that can still be followed. What this means is that it's one place, one place to go. So if you need an enterprise-wide view of the current state, that's available without having to go to all these different sources. But politically, they can still be distributed amongst the various regions. Again, one-stop shop. And as I mentioned earlier, and you saw on the last slide, once this data is in the database, you can leverage that in the other areas of or the other services provided by your IT department. So you can track incident trends. You know, if there's certain models of computer that happen to have higher incident rates than others, maybe you can plan around that in your purchasing strategy. And you can also leverage business service maps to assess impacts. So if your database is now populated and you have those relationships tied together with a business service, you can see where impact will happen once. If a server happens to go down, you can tie that back to a business service provided by your department and get ahead of that problem before it ever happens. Here's another image that is a great reference to showing kind of how everything is related together in the CMDB world. Across the top, you'll see the different IT systems and monitoring tools. So these are other platform-specific databases or monitoring tools that can help feed information into the database. Along the left, you'll see some of those manual sources that we talked about. So this can be purchase reports. You'll see some various vendors here. So you can get purchase data information from those, and these all feed into the CMDB. And on the way in, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. But on the way in, you'll see it passes through some business rules and data standardization, where you have the ability to make decisions and assumptions on the data on the way in, so that it provides a little extra value to the end users. Another source on the inside here is you'll see some internal systems. So PeopleSoft or SAP or other procurement systems that you might have can also be leveraged to get that financial data. Really, the more sources, the better. in certain situations where you can, if you can compare data between sources, then you have an extra layer of detail in your environment that you would be able to cross-check and do quality control against. So you see all these data sources feed into the central database. Once you have that, then you can start getting reports out of the database. So you can then report on data integrity or usage, or get snapshots of your current environment and where you are. Again, it's related to change management, incident management. You can relate those items to specific assets to assess impact, and you can also do some exporting to Excel if you want to do some value-added reports that you have that are pretty highly customized, or do some advanced calculations. You can do that as well. So as I mentioned, there's a few different ways of getting information into the database. Mostly we see essentially three common methods of getting that information in. The first being automated feeds. So this, going back to that slide, these are the items that were labeled across the top. So this is monitoring tools. This is other platforms that you can pull data from their database systems. It's essentially all of these different sources within your environment that are capturing real-time production data on your assets. So these are usually brought into the database without any manual interaction. They're brought in on a regular schedule, kicked off by the system. And there are some examples again: SCCM, LANDESK, BES for BlackBerries, or HP SIM, and this can be really anything that's in your environment. Any other tool that is collecting data can be leveraged to bring into the system. The next is manual feeds performed by somebody, a configuration analyst, or some personnel, maybe a purchaser, or some technicians. So this is data that is compiled into spreadsheets and brought into the tool in a manual way, imported via Excel spreadsheet or CSV or anything like that. Usually we would recommend this to be process-based. So in order to regulate this information coming into the system, you really need to have solid foundation in process that will control how or when this information is loaded into the system, so that it's not, you don't see a lot of variation, or it's not something that's going to spin out of control. So an example of that would be, a monthly import on purchases that you've made recently, getting that financial data into the system. Same with disposal. So as your assets are leaving, you're getting reports from your vendors, your disposal vendors on a regular basis. So going through that process of verifying those assets have left and importing that data as well. You can also use it for internal sources. So if you're doing a quarterly scan or a weekly scan, or just as needed, you can scan that data and import it into the system with any business logic you need there. As I've said, that can be done at any time. It can be so as assets are received, as you're getting these assets from the vendors, you can do a quick scan and import them into the system, or you can hold off and do it once a week or once a month. And the last form of data input is manual user modification, and by this we mean directly within the tool. So somebody is logged into the tool and has access to manually change that record directly in the CMDB. This is not preferred, as you can imagine. Human error is always something to consider. You just happen to type the wrong key or anything like that. So it's not preferred. There's less accountability depending on who has access. Some manual updates are necessary. it happens, so there, and your process may require a manual update, and that is necessary. So some of the things you can do to mitigate that risk of somebody typing in the wrong information or forgetting to do something is to lock down who has access to that, and lock down, and most tools have the ability to lock down certain fields. So if you have financial data that is accurate coming from the vendor, maybe you want to lock that down so nobody can change how much your desktop costs or what PO that was on or anything like that. Most tools have the ability to lock that down to a certain select group. The other way is also good from an auditing standpoint is history tracking. You want to be able to make sure that if somebody does update that, you know who updated it and when they updated it, so that you can go back and review that if it's necessary. If something comes up in the future, then you have that accountability to show for it. And again, most of these things you should really have a solid policy or process control first, so that you can control some of these changes and the way the information is getting into the system and is edited into the system. And that will help just keep the data clean and standard and make much more sense and be much more valuable to the company. So as I mentioned, there are some variations that happen amongst different sources, whether it be manual or automated. So in order to kind of make that consolidated and add some real value, we would also recommend that there be some standardization as the data comes in. It's important to ensure that the components are consistent among the models. So for instance, if a computer, or if a SCCM reports a computer as a DC7900 small form factor, and another source just reports it as a DC7900, another one calls it HP DC7900, rather than having 4 or 5 different ways of saying the same thing, being able to standardize that information to one accepted value will add a ton of value later on when you get to reporting or just governance of your environment. It really provides benefit to just easier usability and user acceptance. So as I mentioned, benefits later, cleaner reporting. It's also for end users, it's much easier to do a search. If you need to know all DC7900s in Chicago, it's much easier to just type that one value rather than having to search for 5 different values for the same thing. That's going to give them more confidence that they are finding what they need to find and that they're getting an accurate view of their environment as well. And that also, through reporting, allows tighter governance and the ability to control what's out there, to review what's out there, and if you see any anomalies, you can follow up on those and ensure that the process is being followed there and that there are no gaps. So there's a couple ways to do that. One way that really provides a lot of value is what we call a hardware library. And there's 2 ways of thinking about this hardware library, and it's very common in the software world already. The idea of a software library and a hardware library are similar concepts. What it is in part, is essentially converts incoming value of different variables. So as I mentioned, with the different computer models, the hardware library can look up against those the possible values for that model coming in and standardize it. If it sees DC7900 small form factor, it can turn it into DC7900 so that there's one unique value or one accepted value throughout your database. The other thing the hardware library can do is it can also store information at a model level. So if you know all DC7900s should have 4 gigabytes of memory, or 2 gigabytes, or whatever your configuration is, you can store that at a model level and then make decisions based on that extra information. You can also look at life cycle reason purposes. So when you started purchasing a certain model and how long you purchased that model of computer, and that can be used to also determine device age for refresh purposes. The other way is just having a dedicated resource, somebody like a configuration analyst who looks at this data or manages the incoming feeds on a daily basis or weekly basis, so they can have a good sense of the processes that go into updating this database, and they can review certain information both at the source level. So as it's coming in, they can review this information to make sure it's reporting accurately on an ongoing basis. Or once it's in the tool, they can do audits and make sure that the information is consistent throughout the database. So as I said, you know, there's an opportunity on the way in, but there's also a good business reason to kind of keep doing that maintenance on an ongoing basis. So through periodic review, you can import those data sources to make sure that they're reporting accurate and consistently. And then, as I mentioned, you can also do audits, so auditing certain important fields to make sure that they're being tracked accurately as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike. He's going to finish it up here and talk about some of the management and the life cycle aspects.
Sounds good. Thanks to Andy for starting us off with a nice overview of those topics. Yeah, I'm going to try to breeze through these next few. So just to make sure we have enough time at the end for questions, and if you guys haven't already gotten lunch, make sure you guys have enough time to get lunch too. So first topic is manage permissions and roles. Andy touched on this a little bit earlier, a few slides back, when we were talking about data feeds and inputs into the CMDB, one of them being direct manual editing. And, you know, he mentioned that it's obviously something that's not preferred for obvious reasons. So a lot of asset management tools understand that and have included a feature in their tool, which is essentially a roles and permissions feature that allows the users or admins to establish roles and permissions and lock down certain fields, you know, either at the individual level or at the group level. So there's two really big parts to the roles and permissions. Locking down certain fields, so meaning that they're uneditable, and the other being hiding certain fields from view. So with the first part, with locking down certain fields, obviously this, you know, helps, it prevents any unwanted or accidental data manipulation, and it promotes data integrity. It really helps establish confidence too with end users, knowing that information in those fields really only was or could have been provided through valid sources. And when we say valid sources, the other data feeds, you know, whether the vendor feed, the receive feed. And then the other part is hiding certain fields from view, and that's important as well. You know, a good example is financial data. You know, the vendor feed is a primary source of financial data. You can have anything from PO to unit price, and unit price is the good example there. Obviously, that's a field that not a lot of folks should have access to or viewership of. So, so again, it's really important to use this feature. And again, like I said, it can be permissions can be assigned either at the individual or team level. And another piece of this is you obviously want to control who's importing certain data feeds as well. And I guess one of the ways to do this is really to just limit data importing to only those relevant persons. So maybe the process owner. So, you know, when it comes to the receive file, whoever's in charge or part of the purchasing team, designated person from that team, should really only be responsible for importing that data. You know, it's really the less people involved, the less error, and that's pretty much what it boils down to. So moving on from permissions and roles, we're going to talk about the phases of an asset's life cycle. So Fruition, we published a workflow a while back, and it pretty much just gives folks an idea of the typical standard stages an asset should go through throughout its lifetime. And these are the phases that every asset should hit through its lifetime. We'll see on the next slide there's a bunch of other statuses and conditions that an asset can go through its lifetime, but those are really secondary and supplementary and are only relevant in unique situations. So each stage is defined by a corresponding status or condition, and most statuses correspond to a specific feed. And like I said, the next slide will have a visual and we can get into more detail there. Just keep in mind that a lot of these status, the actual labels, the actual terms are, you know, just something we came up with. They can be adjusted to meet any client's needs, the terminology they use, the culture, however is needed. One thing to point out is that obviously a lot of assets have a collection of various collection of feeds. They'll gain a various collection of feeds throughout their lifetime. You know, Andy touched on that earlier. You know, with the automated feeds, the production feeds, the manual feeds, the vendor and receive feeds. So some logic will need to be put in place. Some custom logic would need to be in place to ensure that the status reflected for a specific asset is accurate at any given time. So an example would be, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we get on to the next slide, and we'll get into more detail there. It'll be a little easier to follow for you guys. So here you are. So if you really want to focus on the first row there, from shipped to destructed, like I said, these are the primary statuses and stages that every asset should really go through its lifetime. It makes it easier to track, and it helps set expectations as well. So shipped, inventory, production, unknown, retired, out for destruction, and destructed. And obviously there's a bunch more there on the page as well. You'll see resold, returned, lost, and like I said, these are unique to certain situations. We don't expect every asset to hit these or represent these statuses, but they're relevant and they might be useful. An example would be if you have an evaluation unit that you're evaluating for purchase, and the reseller sends it to you, and following evaluation and assessment, it's sent back. You want to set that record to returned in the database, and that's assuming obviously the record even exists in the first place in the system. So I'm just going to go through each of these primary statuses from shipped to destructed, and just give a little background on each of those and what they represent. So with shipped, this pretty much indicates that the asset was ordered and has been shipped by the vendor or reseller, whoever you have a partnership with. And going back to the data inputs again, this comes from the vendor feed, which is a manual import. And just to back up, these statuses could really come in any order, to be honest with you. You might see an asset hit a monitoring tool, and before a vendor feed's even imported, and that's okay. And that's why it's really important too to have logic in place to ensure that the right status is represented and reflected on the record. So moving on to inventory. Inventory pretty much just indicates that the asset is available for deployment or even redeployment. And that's another manual feed import typically. That's a feed that comes, that's really the ultimate or the last step in if you have a purchasing process in place. So again, that just indicates that it's available, it's in-house, and it's ready for deployment to a user or partner. So from inventory, there's production. That's status that usually corresponds or pretty much exclusively corresponds to a monitoring tool. So once that device is picked up by Landesk or SCCM, or if it's a printer or WebJet, if it's picked up by that tool, it's obviously in an active state. It's being used. So you would want to indicate that on the record, so you know that it's in fact being used and it's been assigned to a partner. Again, production is just a term we use. You can use pretty much anything else. In service, active, whatever works best for your organization. Unknown, that's pretty helpful. This really just indicates that an asset hasn't been scanned or reported by the monitoring tool after a certain amount of time. An example would be 30 days. So, if you have signed an asset to a partner or a desktop, and it's been reporting production, and all of a sudden it falls to unknown, that's going to trigger an investigation. You'll want to know why. Is there a reason why? Is it a network problem? Who knows? I mean, has the device been stolen? Is that why it's not reporting on the network anymore? So that's a good status to have in place, just to make sure that the asset is still being used and is part of the environment. And unknown, I mentioned earlier that typically statuses they correspond to a certain feed. That's not always the case. It depends on process, what you guys have in place. Like I mentioned earlier, inventory and shipped. Inventory corresponds to receive feeds typically. Shipped can correspond to a vendor feed. Production or monitoring tool. Unknown is, that's typically a system calculation. where it's basically looking at the last time it was scanned, and if it's been beyond a certain set amount of time, you can set a logic in place that'll transfer or transition that to unknown. So moving on, so from unknown, retired, typically we like to see things move from, it's ideal to see things move from production to retired without that unknown piece, but not everything's perfect. But retired, this pretty much just indicates that an asset has reached end of life. It's obsolete, and it's pretty much in queue for destruction. It's really not part of the environment anymore. I mean, it is, but it sets the expectation that this device is no longer in use. It's in the initial stages of being replaced as part of the life cycle process. So, and with retired, again, that depends on process. That can be part of a feed, a data feed import to get certain assets to retire. That can be through custom scripts. It can even be through manual updating as well to the record. And obviously, with the manual update piece, you want to make sure a limited audience has access to do that. So after retire, there's the destructive piece, and that just indicates the device has been removed from the environment and it's no longer there. It's no longer a part of it, and the confirmation comes from the destructed or your destruction partner, whoever that may be. So, and that's typically a manual import as well. So that pretty much touches on every stage of the life cycle, I guess, flow, you could say. And again, there's a bunch more things on here, and it might be handy to print this out or look at it a little more closely. But obviously, you can see there's a lot more other statuses that a device can go through throughout its lifetime. If you have any questions on them specifically, let us know. I think they're all pretty self-explanatory. So moving on to life cycle timelines. Life cycle timelines, important. This is just really, you want to obviously make sure that your partners are using current equipment that can get the jobs done. Equipment that meets system requirements. So one of the first stages of beginning to work out life cycle timelines is you want to assess the current state of your environment, and there's, well, three primary ways to do that, and there's actually four, but so with device age, this pretty much determines eligibility, whether or not an asset is eligible for life cycle. So, and that all depends, though, on the company's published depreciation cycle. So, for example, with desktops, the depreciation period for a desktop might be 4 years. So, obviously, after once a device hits 4 years or beyond, it's eligible for life cycle. It's eligible to be replaced. But another part of that, though, is another filter on that is status, what we just kind of talked about. There's obviously devices that are going to be in an ineligible status. And an example would be if something's retired or destructed, obviously it's already been replaced and been taken care of. However, the statuses of inventory and production, that still indicates that the asset is part of the environment. It's still out there and needs to be replaced. So those two work hand in hand, really, device age and the status of the device. So another important piece is resources. Obviously, you want to make sure that you have the resources to make the replacements, and that's just kind of like the physical bodies, to make sure that you have the staff to actually action those replacements. You know, remove the device from the environment, put it in the destruction pile, and swap it out for a new device. And obviously, you know, money plays a big part in this as well. That's really the ultimate decider in what can be life cycle and what can't be. So with budget, you know, that's, like I said, that's really the ultimate factor. You could have 500 desktops eligible for life cycle, but you may, you know, only have the funds to life cycle 300. So so that's pretty much it with life cycle. You know, one of the things too is to keep in mind is you may have a large eligible environment of assets, eligible meaning eligible for life cycle. But again, like I said earlier, with budget, you might not have the funds, so that helps in creating a targeted life cycle report, and that helps narrow it down. So from there, it's just a matter of deciding what assets to life cycle first. You know, maybe you can determine what's oldest and kind of sort and do it in that order. And you know, with the device age piece, determining the age, we're at 12:26, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. But back to device age, that's you can look back to the vendor file for that, because you can get the financial information from that. As you know, example being the order date, and you know, present date minus the order date, you can pretty much determine how old a device is in years with that. So the last piece, I think, is reporting, and reporting is very important. It's pretty much the checks and balances to making sure that the system tool is reporting accurate information consistently. So there are definitely a variety of reports that can be used to help attain that. Just to go through these bullets, so obviously, you know, data reporting helps isolate assets that meet a certain area of concern or interest. So instead of having to look for certain assets one by one, or having a kind of unstructured, you know, search process, reports help consolidate all that information in one place. From there, you can action anything if needed. So obviously, like I said, it helps sustain data integrity, enforces compliance, and it also helps with decision making. That's a big piece, you know, and that goes back to life cycle, what we just talked about. You know, with life cycle reporting, it helps management make decisions on what they can life cycle based on budget, and what's currently out there in the environment that's eligible for replacement. So some management tools allow for reports to be produced and distributed automatically. Scheduled distribution, that can be pushed to end users or groups on a regular basis, monthly, weekly, however necessary. And obviously there's the on-demand piece too, where users can pull the report whenever needed. based on a request or just for general interest. And reports can be designed for specific audiences, from local teams to the worldwide audience, and that varies on what the report is, who needs to see it, who it's relevant to. So on to the next slide. Just a couple of examples of reports. Reports that identify process gaps. An example would be identifying assets that have not been reported by the monitoring tool yet. So computers that have been purchased but have not been picked up by the production feed yet. That's kind of a big concern because you obviously want to know why. This helps enforce FIFO policy. You really want to find out, is it a network problem? Was this device deployed and the network's not just picking it up, or is it still sitting on the shelf for some reason and FIFO policy has not been followed in that case? So another, data integrity. This is actually a big one. This helps just to make sure that data remains honest and true. Examples would be, a report on any malformed serial numbers, records having similar serial numbers, and improper models. This is obviously a report that can be actioned and is very helpful to the specific teams, whoever the audience is. Status reports pretty much just give a snapshot of the current environment at a given time. Big one is, a production report, just showing, what's currently out there in your environment right now that's being used and that's active. And this might help too with, so if you were to go ahead and produce this report, if you see an older model still in production status, that's obviously that's a cause for concern. So this helps prompt investigation and finding out why exactly you still have a 8-year-old laptop that's being used when it probably should have been life-cycled. Life-cycle reports, we kind of talked about that earlier in the last slide. Identifies assets that have reached end of life, $0 book value, and they're eligible to be replaced. This all depends, though, again, on your published or your established life-cycle depreciation cycle. So, 4 years for desktops is pretty common, 4 years for laptops, 4 years for printers. So whenever an asset reaches that age and beyond, they're eligible for life cycle and can be captured in this report. Ad hoc, and obviously that's just for anything of interest or for any request that's floated your way. If you need to pull a report on the number of 19-inch monitors in Chicago, pretty easy, or the number of 7700s having substandard memory below 2 gigs. So this just helps enforce system requirements and standards too. So again, I apologize. I know we kind of ran a little long with that. I think that pretty much sums it up, because reporting is actually the last piece we wanted to talk about. Thanks for bearing with us. So, if you have any questions, feel free to send them, our way now, or go ahead and email us as well. I know it looks like Nick asked a question earlier about clusters, and I'm going to go ahead and let Andy answer that right now.
Yeah, so it looks like we just have one question out there. If you want to throw something up there in the next couple seconds here, we can try to answer that as well. So the question was posed: how are clusters tracked? And that is a difficult one. That's one of the more technically based ones. So that one kind of depends a lot on your environment and what resources you have available. And by resources, I mean what kind of discovery tools are out there pinging your environment, and what kind of information can you get from those. So I'm not sure how detailed of an answer I can give you other than just kind of a high level. So as I mentioned, it kind of depends on what information is out there. And then once you have that information available, really the key part in the clusters is developing those relationships between assets, whether those are physical assets that are driving those or the virtual assets. There might be some initial legwork in setting up that relationship so that it remains in the system and doesn't get overwritten by other feeds or anything coming in. So like I said, it depends on your environment, and it also might require some manual work with relationships. Let's see what else we have out here. So just some initial elaboration on the clusters. As I mentioned, it's a common thing. Some people have had success more so than others, and like I said, it kind of depends on what resources you have available and the tool you're using to track those. It may, if you have some discovery out there that's finding it, it may require, in order to get some of those relationships and some of those things set up on the back end, it could require some customization in the information coming in, maybe some logic built into the system, or maybe an app built on top of the tool, so that it allows you to more closely identify those and keep track of them on an ongoing basis. But that's a great question, and it's one of the common struggles. So definitely not alone in that, but there are ways, and sometimes those are more customized to certain environments. Let's see here. I don't see any more questions out there, so if you want to let it digest and let it sink in for a little while, feel free to do so. As Mike mentioned, we do have some social networking sites out there. Let me see if I can get back a slide here. There we go. So if you can't think of anything right now, but if something pops into your head later this afternoon or in the future, please feel free to hit us up on Twitter or Facebook. We also have a page on LinkedIn if you just kind of want to check out who we are and what we're about. That being said, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We hope it was helpful or beneficial.
Yeah, and again, this presentation will be put up on the website. I think Andy mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, so it will be up there in a week or so. So if you want to take a closer look or copy some of the images, it'll be up there soon. So.
Yep, I think that's it. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a great weekend.
Thanks.